It is assumed, quite rightly, that British power, British Empire, decreased markedly, both due to the First World War and certainly by the end of the Second World War, and that it was a shadow of its former self. By 1956, the Suez Crisis showed that Britain could no longer be a great power on the world stage, and the United States had taken its place in that regard very clearly. But nevertheless, if we look at the nature of British power now and its continued reach, particularly through the work of my colleague Tim Coles, who I'm kind of representing really today, Britain's role is still really significant. It's still a member of the G7, it's still a member of the UN Security permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's still, as well, in terms of the nefarious activity, it is still one of the world's largest arms dealers, for example. But then in addition to that, part of what Tim Coles' work has discovered is that British involvement as a military force in terms of training, arming, supplying, and in other ways assisting dictatorships and rather unpleasant insurgencies around the world is much greater than anyone had previously much greater than people have put together.
Right.
And Tim has mainly done this through looking at very, very boring government documents that no one else can be bothered to read, to find that British military involvement exists in places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Papua and Oman, and of course other slightly more obvious places like Saudi Arabia. But if you were to ask most people where is Britain in the world, where is Britain involved militarily, they would probably say Afghanistan, and they might say Iraq, and as I say in the book, didn't we leave Iraq anyway? And of course, you know, there's still huge military bases there and a huge military presence.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redman. You can find this show here at my website, which is porkinspolicyreview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. I'm on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, a lot of other podcatchers that are out there. Pretty much all major podcatchers will have the feed. I'm also on YouTube, so if you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please do so. Of course, you can find everything archived here at my website, porkinspolicyreview.com. You can also follow the RSS feed directly if you'd like to. And if you want to support my work, then please go to patreon.com/Pierce Redman, and you can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. And that single solitary dollar gives you access to the exclusive monthly bonus podcast, so it's well worth every penny. I don't promote this enough, but you can also, of course, send a donation on PayPal. I have the link is on the left-hand side of the webpage of my website, so definitely go there. I know there are some people that prefer to use PayPal, so if that's the way you want to do it, then please do so. Well, I am very excited about today's show. Oh, actually, before we get started, I should just note this will probably I'm sort of reworking the format of the podcast right now, and it will probably go back to the regular 2-hour format, or possibly like an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes with some music. We're still sort of figuring that out. So this will probably not be the regular 2-hour episode, but all the same, I am very excited about my guest, a good friend of the show, someone who faithful listeners will remember. We are joined once again by our good friend Matthew Alford. Matthew is he teaches at the University of Bath. He's also the writer of several books, including The Writer with No Hands, about Gary DeVore's murder, National Security Cinema with our good friend Tom Secker, and he is also the author of a brand new book, Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, which he co-authored with TJ Coles. I'm very excited to have Matt on the show to discuss this book, but Matthew Alford, how are you? It's good to be speaking with you.
Hello, Piers. Yeah, I'm very well, thanks.
Excellent. We've got a lot of new listeners to the show. And it's been quite a while since you and I have spoken for a podcast or anything like that. So just give the listeners a little overview. Who is Matt Alford?
Well, I teach at the University of Bath in Britain. I've been teaching there for a good 10 or 15 years, and I've written various books while there. One called The Writer with No Hands, about the mysterious disappearance of Hollywood screenwriter Gary DeVore. But mainly I've been, for the last sort of 15 years, I've been looking at the film representations of American foreign policy, the way that American cinema in particular depicts American power throughout the world. And I found initially with that the Hollywood system tends to be very favourable towards sort of American history, and it basically it's almost like Hollywood's sort of like a wing of the Democrat Party. Really, It's not to say that it's always totally balls out Republican bullshit, but it is nevertheless sort of very sympathetic with the kind of sort of generally goes along the Hillary Clinton line, and to most of us in the rest of the world, that's quite pro-war. So I've been quite cynical about that, and quite uncomfortable with what Hollywood does in general, and the media. And this all came out of work I did on Noam Chomsky and on his theory of media, and I sort of critically analysed that for a lot of my work. And then more recently, I've been working with Tom Secker, because we found just loads and loads of documentation that backed up the idea that actually this wasn't just sort of Hollywood making stuff that happened to be very sympathetic to the American state, American military state, but actually was very consciously manipulated by the national security state in a way that you could say is a national scandal, or indeed even a conspiracy, because it's sort of hidden. But then I sort of feel that my work on Hollywood film and media and sort of propaganda and manipulation is just sort of starting to wind down a bit, really. I haven't written an academic article on this for about 18 months, and I was sort of looking around for a new project. I've been doing more stuff on stage, more creative things, and I came across this researcher called Tim Coles from the University of Plymouth in Britain. And Tim is a really remarkable sort of thinker. He speaks extremely clearly about his subject area. He doesn't engage in any nonsense at all, and he's very clipped in his use of language. And he's been looking into, for about 15 years, British foreign policy, and he's really the only person. There are two or three other kind of candidates who look at British foreign policy sort of secret documents, or hidden, one way or another, hidden documentation, or unseen, unused documentation, particularly from the present day, up to the minute. And so I don't know if any of your listeners might know Mark Curtis's work, who did Web of Deceit, sort of looking at the sort of 50s and 60s and 70s British foreign policy, and basically digging up lots of sort of dodgy information on the real motives of British policy planners to do with oil and so on throughout the Middle East and elsewhere. But basically, Tim's doing the even more up-to-date version of that as best he can. And Tim's work was really, really good. And we appeared on a TV show together last summer. And out of that, I sort of said, I'd like to do something on British power, on British foreign policy, on actual British politics, rather than always talking about representation, Hollywood, media, America. And particularly, in a way, it's a bit of a moral thing as well, because it's like, it's all very well to criticize the United States all the time. And, we should, because, it is a global entity that affects all of our lives. But at the same time, what my country does, what my government does, what our state does is, more my responsibility. And I think that's the way that Tim sees it. And, I felt that it was a good thing to be able to say something critical about what the about what Britain's been doing, particularly as the evidence to suggest that Britain's role in the world is much greater and more destructive than I'd realised before having long discussions with Tim. So I was excited to work on this project with him, and yeah, I think we created quite a decent book, Union Jackboot. So if listeners want to take a look at it, they can see big chunk of it for free on the internet, because we've put out various pieces, various extracts on lots of different websites and all sorts of little news thingies, and also there's part of it on Amazon for free. And if you want to buy it, then you can either buy the cheap version, which we're calling the third world version, for a tenner, or you can buy the first world version, which is basically just the same but in colour, for about 50 million quid. But that's just our little joke, really. But it is that we have done it like that, because if people do want a colour version, then they can, because there's a nice. We tried to make it an unusual book by. By the way, you can interrupt me at any point. I know.
No. Continue.
I know I'm rabbiting on horrendously. You know when you have headphones in and it makes you go slightly crazy, as if you're underneath swimming. I feel like I'm drowning in about 3 meters of water. So I'm just sort of.
Well, here I'll interrupt you for a minute so you can get above the water,
to the surface,
so to speak. Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, the book is fantastic. I highly recommend that you go out and get a copy of it. I think that my listeners would really appreciate it, particularly too when we're talking about. Like so much of my show and the episodes I do is, it's all about American foreign policy and, the horrible stuff that it's doing abroad and at home. And I think we do have this perception that America is like the worst entity on the planet. And I guess you can certainly make that argument, and the influence that the U.S. has on virtually all corners of the globe is tremendous. But, I think that we sort of miss the larger picture. We miss that there are other, powerful countries operating, doing horrific things and we don't hear about it. We don't talk about it. And it's not even just the UK. I mean, look at, France right now in Africa. Certainly, there's a million examples of this. And also I think it's worth, I think particularly for an American audience, to study Britain, because it's like we sort of learned from our our colonial overlords. We learned a lot of the sort of tricks of the trade from British foreign policy and stuff that you and Tim Coles talk about throughout the book. And also it's a fascinating book because the style, Matt, is very different from. It's not a regular kind of like academic book or even just like a nonfiction book. Talk a little bit about the style of the book, because it's very different, but I think it works really well. We were talking off air. I really enjoyed the conversational tone of the book. So just explain a little bit about the style.
I think we kind of wanted it to sound a little bit like a conversation down the pub. Mm-hmm. So, because it's so frustrating talking about politics in general, because it's kind of a turn off for a lot of people. And then even on top of that, when you're talking about politics from an academic point of view, you end up having loads of theoretical perspectives, which is even more of a turn off. Yeah. So Tim and a very small number of other people are not theoretical like that. They're not international relations theorists. Tim is in a completely different field. Tim is primarily, his work is to try and find a cure for deafness. That's his academic work, is to find a cure for deafness.
Really?
Yes. But he's got a sort of moral thing going on where, and also the kind of brain that's really, really good for it, who, he researches using pretty obscure documents what the, how to the British foreign policy and lots of other subject areas as well. But he did another book about human rights, which was called Human Wrongs, and various other books. And so, sorry, just a sec. Someone's come in, so I just have to.
No problem.
I just have to edit that out. So yeah, we wanted the book to sound like it was discussed at a bar, and so we did actually have those conversations over the phone with me wandering around in the garden with a bottle of wine. And it was actually really, really.
I was
nice
that was my question when I was reading it. I was like, I wonder, was this like Matt emailing a question and getting a thing? Because literally, I mean, the book is you pose a question to Tim, and then he answers the question, but it's not like a yes or no. I mean, he does break it down. He explores different facets, and then you sometimes disagree with him. There's a little bit of back and forth. It does have that feel. I mean, I can now imagine you walking around your garden, with a glass or two of wine, just sort of, yeah, but what about this? I mean, isn't this a good thing? And then hearing Tim kind of respond to it. And that's how the book functions. And, I think, some people might be like, who wants to read like a transcript of a conversation, it's of a conversation or something. But it really does work well. And I mean, I truly found myself like, there are just moments in the book where I was like, oh damn, like I never even thought of it like that, or and I think Tim's he can be very concise as well, and he offers his opinions or facts and stuff in such a clear way. I mean, the book is approachable too. You don't have to, like you said, I mean, you don't have to be a international relations theorist. You don't have to be well-versed in geopolitics or British politics or anything like that. You can really... I think anyone can pick up the book and instantly be, gripped by it. And at the same time, too, I mean, you explore so many interesting facets that we'll get to in a little bit. But it really is like a full book. I mean, like I said, I love the style, and I think I think it actually kind of works for like the sort of like, cultural environment that we're in right now. I think the conversational tone of it is great, because a lot of this too is like, these are conversations that I'm sure a million people have had.
I think that's right. And it's like, I'll give you an example would be that, you can criticize the American government or the British government or your own country, whatever it is, until you're blue in the face. But actually, what tends to happen with people is that they still hold on to certain ideas that mean that their country is still good to them in some way. I'll give you a good example. I still find it difficult to shift the idea that Winston Churchill was a national hero. Yes. Like our number one national hero, if you take any poll, is Winston Churchill, because he won World War II. Now, even when you say to people, yeah, but he gassed loads of people, he killed the Kurds with poison, with poison. He used racist language all the time. He was a horrible bully. He was a misogynist. He was Even
India,
at the end of that,
South Africa,
and also whole starvation of India. Millions of people, and also a disastrous campaign in World War One. He was just a real hoodlum who got lucky. But there's still that tendency as a British person to be like, come on, what?
He beat Hitler.
He beat Hitler. So that's all that matters. And so I keep on going back to that, and I don't let Tim off the hook with that question and several others, where Tim's trying to be really rational. And I'm saying, yeah, but come on, we did something right. This isn't all about Britain's secret wars. Why are you being so down on Britain? Come on, we do something. Come on, how much better do we have to be for you to admit that you can be just that little bit proud of this country? Come on, be proud in the group. Why don't you at least care about your group a little bit, rather your nation? I know it's irrational, but go for it. Come on, stop being such a killjoy. All that kind of thing. That's what those conversations were all the time. And it's not that I wholly believe that, because obviously I don't really believe in sort of rah-rah, my football team, right or wrong. But I've got a bit of that in me, and Tim doesn't. And so I really wanted to push him hard with that, because that's the way that everyone will react, to the guy down the pub who knows a load of stuff.
Yes.
People will say, yeah, but none of that's important, because in the end, we're doing this now.
No, go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
So I was going to say, Tim is like sort of. I don't think Tim would be as conceited as to call himself an intellectual, but basically, because I'm not. Because at least the character that I'm playing, which is a big part of myself, is not a kind of classic intellectual. He ends up playing the intellectual, but then it is this clash between kind of what one might call kind of common sense bloke down the pub attitudes, and but then those two figures not letting go. And particularly with one of them really, really, really knowing his stuff, and that's Tim. He really, really knows the material extremely well. I think it's been quite an obsession for him for a long time. He certainly churned out a hell of a lot of books in a very short time. So yeah, I found it a really, really enjoyable process to make the book. Yeah. And then I should add as well that we did do whatever it was, like 15 or 20 hours of transcribed conversations with, like I say, me pacing around the garden, but with a bottle of wine, sometimes with a glass, and sometimes just the bottle.
Yeah.
But then after that, we did go through it. Primarily, it was Tim who went through it, just to neaten it up and make sure that it's really, really easy to follow. So when we mention Jeremy Corbyn, we sort of say who is the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labour Party in Britain. So that all those things added up, and he also was able to add in about 200 footnotes to make sure that every piece of information that he provided was linked to a mainstream reliable source, and so I hope that makes it the people who read it will not just be interested and not just see it as one person's opinion, but I think it's a legitimate way of presenting a larger body of work that Tim's produced over the last few years.
Oh, and I was going to just add on just that last thing, but the footnotes are excellent. I mean, the book is like worth it just for the footnotes. I already have a list of, writers and journalists and stuff that Tim references throughout. It's worth it just for that. But back to what you were saying about, you're the guy down the pub, and Tim is the quote unquote intellectual. I mean, but he doesn't, it doesn't come off in like a condescending way, It comes off as someone that's like, okay, sure, I accept what you're saying, but here's just the cold hard facts, and not in like a mean way or anything like, I think the Churchill example is great. I mean, and there's some great, the whole section you're talking about, like World War II and stuff, is great, because that is one of those like, well, but come on now, you're really telling me that this was a bad thing. And I just, whenever people, just as an aside, whenever people bring up how wonderful Winston Churchill is, I always think of the stories when he would visit the White House, and he would just be wasted, walking around naked in the White House, going into various people's rooms, just shit-faced. And it's like, this guy, it's like, what? I mean, just imagine. Hashtag me too.
I'm starting to like him again, actually. You mentioned that.
Well, let's explore a couple of. The book is there's a lot in there. We're not going to be able to cover all of it on the show, but let's pick apart a few of the interesting aspects of it, or some of the really fascinating threads. I mean, a big one, and one that I think we would be remiss if we didn't just briefly touch on a little bit. Excuse me as I burp into the microphone there. Is because it's also, again, it's in the news, endlessly here, and I can't even imagine what the coverage is like in the UK. But Brexit, I mean, you do, and that's sort of an early chapter in the book. I guess, my first thing, and I was never like, I never really thought like, I was never of the mindset of like, I was like, I didn't know where I stood when it came to Brexit, as if like my opinion even matters as an American. But, I did more or less just think, well, this really does seem like a movement that's being, hijacked by a very, upper crust elite, borderline to openly racist. But, I think you present the Brexit argument again, cutting away a lot of the sort of political ideology and just break it down into cold hard facts, which is obviously why, like, I think, I'm sure Theresa May is having such a problem, selling this and doing it, because when you do just sort of break down to like the everyday things, particularly like the Northern Ireland issue, it's just like, why would anyone want to do this? But I mean, Matt, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the Brexit chapter, and also maybe just as someone in the UK right now. I mean, like, what is going on with Brexit? Because I've sort of removed myself from it because I just like couldn't. Between that and Trump, I just like it's you can only follow one horrible story at a time. So give us just a quick overview of Brexit right now.
Oh my word. Well. To start with, we're all so close to Brexit here that it's just driving everybody mad. And I'm not sure if I can say anything that's like particularly original. I think what Tim was saying in the book, and as I say, Tim is the expert in this. I'm someone who's sort of involved in the production of the book. But what he's saying is that basically either way you go with Brexit, you lose, because you've got this neoliberal organisation, which is the European Union, which is basically just imposing quite an extreme form of capitalism on all of its member states. It is a capitalist entity and neoliberal ideology, but at the same time, just sort of wrenching our country out of it. It seems like a very risky and pointless enterprise, really. So, I mean, I don't know how much you want me to go into that because that's obviously happening 24/7 over here at the moment. But it's not working. I mean, no one would say that it's working well. It just, in practical terms, leaving a massive trade bloc is not very easy. So it's just dictated the all discourse in this country for over 2 years and looks set to do so for many years more. So, and over an issue which is basically just, should you be in a trade bloc or not? It's like, I mean, what's the point? It's a crazy kind of crazy situation to have happened, and seems very dangerous. So I think that's part of the problem. No one had any particular love for the EU in the first place, particularly because of the EU since Maastricht, which in the early 2000s that allowed there to be freedom of movement, which basically meant that Britain's borders weren't really controlled by our own government and so on. So, no one could really pluck up much of a sort of yay Europe when a couple of years ago. But I think for the sort of people like me anyway, who were just sort of like, yeah, well, nothing's perfect, let's just go with it. So but yeah, that's basically what's happening. And then, I mean, I've just been going through the news for today, just late this afternoon, and I mean, the country in general is just insane at the moment. We've got this is the main headline on BBC News, and this is partly just because everyone's so desperate not to talk about Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May scrapes the mould off jam. So in a cabinet meeting, Theresa May has said that if jars of jam get mouldy, she just scoops the crappy bit off it and eats jam. And I think it was in a discussion about food waste. So I don't know. I mean, I guess you can say things like that, but it does speak to that kind of austerity kind of I don't know, sort of a very peculiar sort of. I just find Theresa May a very peculiar sort of character. She kind of emblematizes Brexit because she obviously doesn't to do it, and she doesn't want to. She looks like she doesn't want to be in this life. Just by looking at her, it's just like she doesn't even want to buy a new pot of jam. Do you know what I mean? That's
right.
Is that And so, but that's the kind of discussion we're having in our country at the moment. We've also got our new defence secretary has just said a couple of hilarious things over the past 48 hours. Well, not hilarious, really. Gavin Williamson boasts that Brexit could enhance the UK's lethality. So
what?
That's all that we could,
kill better.
It's going to be more lethal after Brexit.
Oh, good.
So I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear that. He also referred to the Russian government by saying, frankly, Russia should go away and should shut up. He's been in an interview where the interviewer actually terminated the interview because he was so blatantly stonewalling answers to questions. That's our new defence secretary, and before that we've had foreign secretary, which was Boris Johnson, who I'm sure it will have reached your shores that this guy is a complete. I don't want to say imbecile because he kind of wants to play on that image, but a very dangerous, reckless Brexiteer, harumphing. One of these people who said that £100,000 a year is pocket money, because that's what he was getting for it. A lot of these things come out in this very rich text that Tim provides in our book, which is just this detail on detail of how really quite sour and sort of shitty a lot of these people are who are running the government. I suppose just in general with my politics as well, I wouldn't call myself a conservative, but I'm not entirely hostile to conservatism as a thing. But my God, you look at the people on the front bench in Britain who are actually representing those ideas, and you just want to tear your hair out.
Well, they're not like. They don't seem like real people. You know what I mean? Like they really seem so like Theresa May. It really, I don't think, like you said, I mean, she is like this metaphor for Brexit. I mean, she doesn't want to be there. It doesn't look like she wants to be Theresa May, and
she reminds me, the Ice Queen in, it was snowing the other week, and I was thinking, we had a blanket of snow, and it reminded me of the Queen. Was she called Anya from Frozen?
Yeah.
When she takes her gloves off and the whole kingdom just goes white. That's what Theresa May is like to me. She is like Queen Elsa. I think it's Elsa, or is it Anya? Elsa, I'm being told. Queen Elsa. She's just like all of that kind of pent up sort of frostiness.
Yes.
She's just dropped her pair of magic gloves, and it's just the whole country is gone completely frozen wasteland.
No, there are times where I almost feel bad for her, because you can just tell that like her life is just a misery right now. I mean, there's no way she enjoys waking up in the morning, opening up all the newspapers kind of seem to despise her or criticize her. I was watching, just briefly this morning, preparing some, I guess it was like her update to the House of Commons on Brexit. And I mean, it's just everyone screaming at her. Clearly what she knows what she's saying is a joke. Like when she talks about, Britain being like the, caring about worker rights and all this. I mean, she knows it's a lie. But she's just so bad at selling things. She sort of reminds me of I hope you're familiar with the Thick of It map, but like the Nicola Murray character, where it's like she maybe is like a good person at heart, but she's just so out of her element, and it's comical watching her. And then but then again, you look at these people like Boris Johnson, who I actually he is a buffoon, but I think that's sort of a facade. And he kind of plays that to kind of get away with saying horrific things. Because, like, in reality, he is just, like, one of these, like, terrifying, inbred, sort of aristocratic monsters that still have incredible influence over the lives of Britons.
I'd say that, I mean, this is all sort of pop psychology, really. But I mean, like, to give a sort of broad brush look at those two characters, I'd say Boris Johnson is, I don't think he's inbred. I think he's just someone who is just very reckless because he's never really had to be accountable for any of his actions. And so there was some nice footage you may see, your listeners may Google, where he's playing a rugby match, sort of charity rugby match, and he's kind of tackles a kid way too hard. I know we can all make mistakes, but that's basically Boris Johnson. Is just hammering into people without really particularly care. I don't think that necessarily means he's sociopathic. I know it's very kind of fashionable these days to kind of
everyone's
label
a psychopath.
Sociopath or something. But I don't think that. I think but he is definitely very reckless with other people's feelings, whether through language or actions. And I think Theresa May, again, is not someone who is, like you say, I don't think she's inherently kind of evil, but I think she is. I think she's a very, very unhappy person.
Yeah. Obviously.
And again, I mean, look at the way she carries herself. She tried to dance onto the conference podium when she was giving a speech a few months ago, and
it's cringing. I know. I mean, that's what I mean. I feel bad. It's just like she must hate this. I don't think she ever wanted to be PM. Really. I mean, maybe at one point, but like I would think a week or so into this, she was just saying to herself, what the fuck have I got myself into? This is not what I wanted. I
disagree with that. I think that Theresa May, and I think there are quite good accounts for this, that she's wanted to be Prime Minister for several decades. Her husband kind of let it slip a couple of years ago that, that I think he sort of spoke without meaning to say it and implied that she had already been, wanting to do this for a long time, which didn't sound very good because she was in a leadership sort of
position at the time.
And this is going to sound horrible because I don't mean this as a sort of nasty thing to say about her or indeed anyone else who's suffered loss. But Theresa May lost her parents really quite early in her life, in her 20s, and she was not able to have children. I don't think, and I'm not quite sure why. But I just feel that you can see in Theresa May that she's trying to plug something emotionally, and just the whole way she carries herself. But at the same time, as that's a human thing, and care for her as a human being, I don't have any sympathy for her because actually that is her job. She's being paid extremely well. She is someone who, whipped up a lot of these problems in terms of immigration well before the Brexit vote. I think she was the person who sent around, because she was Home Secretary at the time, sent around vans going around certain areas of the country saying, if you're not supposed to be here, we're going to send you off, send you back to your own country. She's part of this system. And, I don't have any, I don't care. I do not. I don't, and I don't think we should, because I think it's very dangerous to say, "Oh God, Brexit's a bit of a nightmare," but God, I really feel sorry for Theresa May. No, and that's making it about one person. In 6 months' time, when she's gone, or a year or whatever it's going to be, because it's not going to be that long, that who cares what her particular feelings are? She'll be enjoying it anyway. Enjoying it as much as she can enjoy anything anyway. So,
yeah.
I don't think she would enjoy a flume ride in chocolate. Do you know what I mean? That is not. So I don't care about Theresa May.
No. I would agree with that. And it's funny too. You were mentioning when she was Home Secretary, having vans going around, terrifying immigrants and whatnot. While at the same time, and you mentioned this in the book, and I've talked about this before with Keelan Balderson. While she was Home Secretary, going after certain immigrants, she was also shipping in, jihadis from Libya because they were promising to get rid of Gaddafi. So a lot of questions that she should be answering.
We pepper the book not only with several images of graffiti that Tim's photographed, but also several jokes. And I think several jokes. I do stand-up comedy, and one of those is about believing in kicking immigrants out, and then sort of saying, starting with MI5's terrorist assets. And,
right? Yeah. Absolutely.
Stop at that point, but not having sort of terrorists and from Libya and Syria on our payroll secretly would be a really good start if you want to stop dangerous people coming in and out of the country.
Oh yeah, sure. And then having them carry out operations, when it's politically advantageous for elections and votes and whatnot. But moving on a little bit, but sort of keeping in with that. I mean, and we don't have to get into too much about this, but I'm just curious, like your take on Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, you do talk about him in the book, and I find him to be this like fascinating figure. While he seems kind of, weak-kneed when it comes to a lot of stuff, and I don't know why he doesn't defend himself more when people attack him. He just kind of says, "Okay, sure, whatever, say whatever. I don't care." But it's funny the level to which the British state seems intent on destroying him should speak volumes about the fact that they fear even this watered down, labor lefty kind of a figure. Kind of in the same way here, I mean, they're going after Tulsi Gabbard, who is not at all this anti-interventionist candidate, and she's a complete joke in my opinion. But still, they're so terrified of the idea that some candidate could, push leaving Syria, that they're willing to throw every slur and epithet towards Tulsi Gabbard, kind of in the same way of Jeremy Corbyn. And I just find that fascinating. And the Jeremy Corbyn, like for instance, the whole, he's an anti-Semite, and it's interesting, we've had the same thing happen literally within just a few days with a new congressperson, Representative Ilhan Omar, who basically she just stated an obvious fact that AIPAC pays for political support, and she's now had to come out and apologize and confirm that she's not anti-Semitic and whatnot. And I just curious, Matt, your sort of take on Jeremy Corbyn quickly.
Well, it's interesting about how they pounce on any of these characters, no matter how watered down their socialist beliefs. I mean, Corbyn really is sort of social democrat type, I'd say. Right. I mean, maybe if he gets in and enacts some form of socialism, I guess it's possible. But I mean, he'd be so restrained by his party anyway that he wouldn't be able to do anything that much. But I think just while you were saying that, I was thinking this is like the threat of a good example, isn't it? It's like, and you could translate that at national level. So it was, I mean, I can't remember which US policymaker was saying it, but in regards to Cuba and also to Vietnam, it's not really that they care that there's a few million people who might be, doing some kind of socialist experiment. And it's not really that they care that there's one guy in Parliament who's saying these crazy things about nationalization. But it's the threat that actually the fact that they can exist then gives strength and encouragement to others to come out. That's the thing really hated about Jeremy. The thing is, they don't hate Jeremy Corbyn. They hate what he represents, which is not just his ideas, but the fact that they had been holding up the Blairite people, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and so on, had been denying the members of their own party a voice for 25, 30 years. And then Corbyn came along, and they I don't know how well you guys know this in this country, but they stuck Corbyn on the ballot as not quite as a joke, but pretty much as a joke, to say we're democratic. When they had to have a new election They said, look, we're democratic. Let's stick on Jeremy on the thing, and he'll get 2%
so we can say
of the vote.
that we did,
So say that we did, but of course he did it, and then they didn't realise this. They hadn't really thought through quite the rules, and they also forgot that Jeremy Corbyn's kind of got a blemishless record. Never said anything wrong or done anything wrong until allegedly all this anti-Semitism stuff, which is total fabrication anyway. But and of course, the members had an enormous voice in the leadership election, and so the members voted 70%. Yeah, let's get Corbyn. Of course, we're going to do that. But the Labour Party have been denying the members, which are about 500,000 people, a voice for so long that they just assumed that the members would vote for their boring middle of the road candidate, but they forgot that actually people don't want that. People I don't even call them activists really. I mean, they're just members of the Labour Party. There's hundreds of thousands of them. So, and yes, the campaign. I mean, I'm very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, and my sense is that he's a decent person. I know a lot of people, well, not a lot, but there are people who are not sort of Daily Mail waving, Murdoch press supporting sort of crazies. There are mainstream people who don't like Corbyn or think that he's making a mistake on certain policies. But I do think that one of the most common policies for that is one that people can't get their head around because they've had another 80 years of propaganda about it, and that's the bomb. It's funny that I've had conversations where taxi drivers and the man down the pub type people, they'll talk about Corbyn and they'll know, because I'm of the right kind of demographic and they vaguely know me, and they'll know that I'm quite supportive, but they'll immediately go to the question about the atomic bomb because Corbyn said, "I will not drop a nuclear bomb," and it's peculiar. Of all the people who, it's the issue. It's like it's such a bizarre, antiquated issue that could never ever come up in the real world. But people don't like it because people have that same thing that me and you talked about at the beginning of this discussion, like they have about Winston Churchill. At least Winston, if they come over it, whoever they are, whether it's the French or the Germans or the Iraqis or the ISISes or whatever the hell they are, that Winston Churchill would smash the shit out of them. And that people love Donald Trump. We're gonna, what did he say? We're
bomb the shit out of them.
Out of them.
Yeah.
But that is great. That is great oratory. That is.
Yes, I know. It's yeah.
I love it. I want to watch Donald Trump saying that for 10 hours, and I want to watch it with a picture of a British flag draped around some boxing gloves, smashing into an animal that I dislike, like a rabid wolf, and that's what I want. But do you think about Jeremy Corbyn doing any of that? He's rational and just inherently human beings, particularly heavily propagandized human beings, like in our modern societies. We're edgy when we get rational. Like someone said it to me 4 or 5 days ago. It was just like, but the bomb, he won't drop the bomb. And I was like, well, when on earth are you going to need to drop the bomb?
and why? Exactly. It's just like I know what you mean. It's so antiquated. It's like, why would you even want to do that? You know what I mean? It's so just the environmental impact alone. Let's just say you dropped it and no one died. Those areas would. I mean, there are people still suffering in Japan from that, but even closer to home, all of the depleted uranium in Iraq, just from the bullets alone, is dwarfing the problems in Hiroshima.
What the argument is, Piers, and I do get it, but I still reject it. But it's that you have to have this threat. Your leaders have to seem crazy enough to actually do it, because then it will deter any enemy from actually attacking you. So actually, by showing weakness, you can actually end up with a more dangerous world. Now, I do get that argument, and it's part of the argument about deterrence. And I'm not rejecting that as a theoretical thing. But I'm also saying which country is going to actually invade Britain? Because you'd literally have to have Russia breach its own borders, go through Belgium, go through the Ukraine, go through France, go across the English Channel to invade and take over an entire sovereign state after trampling through Europe. And then would have to destroy the entirety of Russia, which incidentally has got way more nuclear weapons than us anyway.
Yeah.
And what? Why is Russia going to do this? What, to own post-Brexit Britain?
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, no, totally. That makes perfect sense.
So I think, but that is what the argument. That is a central thing about Corbyn, that he like even you said in your introduction, that he seems like a gentle person, or a bit of a sort of shabby character, wherever it is. You know, that's the thing that they don't like, is that he doesn't cut that kind of Trumpian figure. But we know where these leaders like the Donald Trump types lead us to. It's very rarely to any point of stability. They look like they're strong. They look like they're capable, but actually they're complete chaos behind them, and they don't care, because the only thing they care about really is polishing their own image and trying to give the impression of strength. We know what these strong men are like. We know the kind of carnage that they tend to cause. So I think there's a possibility of some kind of improvement to British society if the Labour Party got in under Corbyn. But that said, a lot of people don't like him for a slightly more legitimate and understandable reason, which is that he's going along with Brexit as well. He's going along with he wants to push a softer kind of Brexit, which involves being in a customs union and blah 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 blah. But Corbyn as a figure, where he had for many millions of people a kind of saintly glow, you know, that kind of hint that, my word, we could have a real change here. What's happened, I think, over the past 18 months, 2 years, is that he's become a bit like, certainly in the national imagination, I think he's become just another politician. I think a lot of people still think he's a good guy, or he's not one of the bad guys, but they still see him as, you know, he's part of the same kind of thing, really, isn't he? I don't believe that. I think that Corbyn is something very different, but I can see why people get that impression. And that's because the whole of political discourse and debate has been just ratcheted off to the right by Brexit.
Oh, and you know, that's across the board, I think, the world over. I mean, look at here in the U.S. I mean, the Democrats have positioned themselves as more, right wing when it comes to almost every issue. You know, in an attempt to beat out Trump. You know, it's like they'll have more wars. You know, it's God forbid. We I don't know. You know, make peace with the Taliban in Afghanistan and all this other stuff. I mean, again, not to defend Trump, because I don't even think he really is fully aware of what's going on around him. He's so just obsessed with Twitter and going to rallies where he can feel like a big man and talk about the wall. But yeah, and I mean, you just look at Bolsonaro and, the right-wing governments coming, in Eastern Europe and in, Duarte in the Philippines and whatnot. But yeah, I think it's just sort of, that, I don't know, like the sort of left is I think at like a crossroads. Although I do think, I do agree with you. I think that, Corbyn does represent something slightly different, kind of in the same way that, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is super flawed. I don't really like her. Although I do think that she's able to tap into a demographic that has long been ignored, which will actually be running the country very soon. And that has upset the status quo of, old farts, that, the type of people that, love, Winston Churchill and the thought of, nuking Iran and all these other countries. So I do think that there is some kind of hope there. I think that she, I think in a similar way, her, even like Bernie Sanders, it's like you kind of need to have those people, like you said, to energize more radical people to actually, talk about change. And just very quickly, the whole thing about, Corbyn not wanting to drop the bomb, that whole argument to me is it's so funny because, we're terrified, allegedly, of Kim Jong-un is about to drop a bomb any moment, So it's like, that's scary. But Jeremy Corbyn not wanting to do it, that, like, it doesn't make any sense. It's just kind of like, it's all insane. Anybody that would want to do that, real or imagined. And it's crazy that, we vilify it when it comes to a North Korean. But, if it was, Theresa May, she wouldn't hesitate to, bomb whatever, North Korea, into the Stone Age with nuclear weapons.
As well, and she said that explicitly a couple of years ago at the beginning of her premiership, where someone asked in Parliament, would you literally vaporize 100,000 people for whatever reason? And usually the standard response is to say we don't comment on specific policy of what we would do under the event of blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
But she said yes.
Yeah, no.
What really annoyed me, though, about that question is that, do you know what? You would not vaporize 100,000 people. You would vaporize millions of people because nuclear bombs are much bigger than people actually think they are. And that's partly because we have this idea from films like The Day After and Terminator 4 and all these things that nuclear weapons can just sort of go off willy-nilly and it's kind of okay.
Yeah.
Like, you start that chain reaction and we are not going to get out of that as a species. We are not going to. You destroy cities, and that is going to be it. Even if one bomb goes off, it's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened. It's going to be, you've got 6 million people going into the gas chambers. You've just done it in a second. So, anyway, I disagree with nuclear weapons, and I don't think, but the main point is I don't think we need them. I don't think Britain needs nuclear weapons. I think it's crazy with the current threats that we face. It is insane to have nuclear weapons, and there is no way that any potential threat could come along that would ever require us to use nuclear weapons. So it's the most gormless thing, as well as being in addition to that. And I'm not confusing this with it, because obviously if our security warranted spending money, then fine. But if you're also talking about chucking tens of millions of pounds at updating Trident, and then there's the additional fact that it makes us more of a target and blah, blah, blah. But the main thing is we don't need it. That's the main thing for me. And it's infuriating to see people try and retain this argument in their minds about the need to have this extraordinarily aggressive response. And it's just because people don't really understand what nuclear weapons are, and they don't really understand deterrence, and because that hasn't really been discussed particularly for the last 30 years either. So we've just allowed this crazy situation to fall between the cracks, that we should just have this sort of basically a doomsday device, and nobody knows what it is. Why no one could justify ever possibly using it. So it's peculiar, really.
No, and we'll move on.
I'd say one thing about Donald Trump as well, because I think it's important as well. Like, part of what we've tried to do in the book is, well, not try to do, it just inherently comes out. Like, I think we're fairly skeptical of the old left and right, and we're fairly skeptical of like attaching ourselves to any particular party. I'm generally sympathetic to Corbyn, but that doesn't mean that I believe in everything and blah, blah, blah,
Sure.
And I think Tim's kind of similar on that. But I thinking about Donald Trump, a couple of years ago when Trump got in, or just before he got in, actually, it was in October, I think, my university was pitching round. They wanted to do a debate a big debate, several hundred people in the audience, and they were trying to find some. And I think the motion was something like this House would vote for Trump or something like that. And this was before I really thought he was going to win either. And they looked around for anyone. The organisers looked for anyone who would defend Trump, because even at the time, people could see that he was not great news. And the only person they could find who would present a defence of Donald Trump was me. So they got me to come in, and I exclusively stuck to foreign policy with Trump and his proposed foreign policy, because it seemed to me that there were certain things that he was going to do quite well. One of those was North Korea. It looked like he was going to. There were indications that he was going to negotiate over North Korea. It looked like he wouldn't invade or escalate the situation in Syria, whereas Hillary Clinton had pretty much promised to invade within days of her being president with ground troops, which I think would have been extraordinarily dangerous. And there were a few other things that Trump seemed quite kind of on, and certainly in the past he'd been relatively reasonable on Libya. He'd been relatively reasonable on Iraq, and so on and so forth. So, I was probably the only person to respond from my university as well when the press asked, what do you think about this shock result with Trump winning? I think I was the only one to even sort of give a tentative, this is better than the alternative, sort of response. So I, for your listeners who are listening, who may be more on the right of the spectrum, or more independent, or however they want to see it, then I think that you would still like this book, and I hope that the way that I'm approaching British and American foreign policy, and I think Tim as well, I think if you read it, I think a lot of it, most people who are interested in factual information will get a lot out of it. There may be a few differences, but of opinion on ideology and so on, but I don't see myself as an ideologue. I never have really. I just I just want to find the best solutions for society. Or at least play some kind of part in finding those solutions. I think they are out there. I think we can have a much better international system than we've got without a great deal of difference, without major changes being made, or certainly without people being any problems being created. I think we could quite easily curtail, for example, the arms trade without it really
making any difference.
Without making any difference, I know that
there's enough weapons.
There's there's enough clothes, isn't there? It's like we talk about.
Yeah, actually, that's a great. I was going to bring that up because I think that's again, I think that like you said, you don't have to come at this from like a left-right perspective or whatever. I mean, there's such honesty in the answers that Tim gives to the questions you pose. And the thing about clothing was a big one for me. And that one really kind of hit me because again, I think that's just like it's just so obvious when you kind of break it down. You're talking about how British foreign policy towards Sri Lanka, which again is there's this perception like only America is involved like all over the world, but Britain is obviously still deeply involved in overthrowing countries and manipulating governments and training death squads and whatnot. But the thing with Sri Lanka was an interesting one. Maybe you can just kind of briefly touch on that one.
Yeah, it was strange. I spoke to a couple of Sri Lankans actually about this because they've said, well, look, the British government's always been very supportive of the Tamil population, but Tim had found evidence that the British government had actually been training the Sri Lankan government, which had been fighting against, in fact, almost entirely destroying the Tamil. And so, sometimes because I wouldn't call myself an expert in British foreign policy. I'm really very interested, and I've learned a hell of a lot from these discussions with Tim and putting this book together. But for a while, I was like, really? Maybe has Tim got this wrong? But then it's just occasionally you find these obscure little sources, just one article here and there from years ago. And it's the case, the British have been very supportive of the Tamil people, at least rhetorically. But then at the same time, we're still selling weapons to the Sri Lankan government on the quiet, and we're still training Sri Lankan government on the quiet. It's the same thing with North Korea. We shout and scream until we're blue in the face about North Korea, not quite as much as the American government has done until recently. But it turns out that we were selling weapons to North Korea for years.
Recently.
Recently, it's like there's all sorts of people on the list of countries that we just sell weapons to, and the British government gives them a license to do that because we don't really have to make any of this. The government's attitude appears to be, we don't really need to. As long as no one really knows or no one really makes too much of a fuss about it, then we don't really have to be very consistent with any of this. So,
yeah.
Kind of bizarre things that happen, training and also training government troops in Colombia as well. It's got a terrible human rights record, and
Myanmar,
all over the place. This is one of the things that really surprised me. I kind of thought, when I first started talking to Tim, I kind of thought that Britain was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe they'd sent some troops to Syria, and but he was rattling off about another 12, 15 other countries that Britain is not just selling weapons to, but actually got advisors on the ground in, or has got secret troops in, as with Syria is a good example, but also over Africa and the Middle East and South America and the Far East, and it just sort of added up to this a picture really of an empire which, yes, of course, is declined, but has almost been a little bit like that famous line in The Usual Suspects about the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was convincing that he doesn't exist, and that's not to exaggerate too much the role of Britain in the world. I'm not, there's a sort of in Iran, I think there's a sort of strong current of belief that Britain is actually the one that's behind everything, even more so than
I think it's like a historical sort of a thing there.
But at the same time, I think if you sort of connect the dots, it does seem that Britain is still, we kind of talk about the decline of empire going back to Suez in 1956 and or even 45 after the war, and that Britain's broken, and yeah, of course, but in the end, we're still the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, even though we kind of talk Britain's roll down. And, we really are the attack dog for the United States as well in many of the most serious conflicts. So, and when we talk about whether you've come across this phrase or not sure, but, when we talk about Britain punch, often you have British government officials saying, Britain's punching above its weight.
Right.
In foreign affairs. Well, damn right they are, because actually they seem to be involved in about 15 different countries, training a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, either to bring down that government, or to support a repressive government. So if you want to call that punching above your weight, yeah, but it's kind of punching with glass in your boxing gloves,
Yeah, no, I mean, like I was saying, I mean, the example with Sri Lanka is so interesting. You talk about the fact that some I can't remember the specific numbers, but it's something like 70% of Britons don't even wear half the clothes that they own. And you talk about, how much, and this is true even in America as well, but I think in the UK to a further extent, I mean, that, a lot of clothes are made in basically sweatshops in Sri Lanka. And you just talk about the connection between, the British government training the military and the police in Sri Lanka to suppress any labor movement, union leaders, killing people in the streets in order to make cheap clothes that Britons won't even wear.
Yeah. And I say, like I say to Tim, because I'm trying again to be the man down the pub. And also I genuinely am a bit I'm like, oh God, but Tim, we can't really be fair to these people because it would mean the price of clothes goes up.
Right.
And his point about that is, if you break it down, even if you want to be that callous and swap human rights abuses for cheaper clothes, actually in practice the price of clothes would not go up very significantly at all anyway. And so, I mean, it's hard to put exact figures on that, but by us treating the rest of the world like dirt, it doesn't that much benefit us. And that's all to do with an economic argument as well, which he brings in about the national interest.
Sure.
What is the
yeah?
Because a lot of this money basically doesn't. A lot of these profits, and the turnover, it goes to these major clothing stores, which actually don't pay tax in our country anyway, so they don't actually benefit us in any way. I think actually Primark might be an exception. I think maybe it does pay its taxes, but there are a lot of other examples. There was another example of actually I don't want to mention the name of it's a very, very famous, very, very British high street brand. Because I can't remember. I think I just have got used to not saying the name because I've been on the news a couple of times and I didn't want them to have to chop out big chunks of what I was saying of libel, but for fear of slander. But the big high street names and various other organisations, oil companies, sponsored an academic book which justified continued British imperial involvement in many of these countries, including Sri Lanka. And so Tim is picking out these influential books that come out of Chatham House, like the British Foreign Policy Talking Location, that kind of characterize elite debate, elite discourse. And he says, well, look at who the people are who are actually putting the money up to pay these academics to do this academic work, which happens to be extremely supportive of the idea of spreading capitalism, of imposing that through violence where necessary. And of course, all the money comes from the major high street brands, and of course from oil companies and arms companies and blah 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 blah. So just that kind of detail that Tim goes into as well, I find really, really interesting. So
no, I agree. I think that when
I said to Tim, I said to him as part of the discussion, I think I say, but it doesn't really matter, does it, Tim? In the end, you've got, I know people have to work in poor conditions and everything, but I've actually heard people literally say this before, which is at least they've got a job.
Yeah, I know, I've heard that too.
But I didn't want to make my argument cartoonish, but I was sort of like, how much difference would it make? I mean, in the end, these people aren't dying while they're doing their job. I mean, it might be bad, but it's not that bad. And then, of course, Tim pointed out, he said, don't you remember on the news just a few years ago, huge fire because no one cares about safety regulations, hundreds of kids dead. I think this was Sri Lanka, but the fact that I don't know it off the top of my head.
Bangladesh. And I think I confused before with the clothing is coming from Bangladesh too.
I don't know that well. It points to how kind of, I'm me and all of us, we're all kind of part of a kind of callous, careless system that prizes clothes over human lives. But Tim just pointed that out, and again, it's just like that's the way he thinks. He's just very matter of fact. It has happened, Matthew. It has happened. Like hundreds, whatever it was, 1,000 people dead.
Yeah.
Kids working in a sweatshop. Happened a few years ago. It was on the news. But no one really draws the links between how that happened, why that happened. Is it going to be allowed to happen again? And of course, yeah. Anyway,
no,
so
yeah.
Really, really interesting. Anyway, isn't it? Isn't it an absolutely fascinating subject? What's going on behind the scenes with all of this? I just find it absolutely sort of chilling, really, and but dramatic as well, and all those things.
No, for sure. I was just very quickly. I was just going to mention, the whole argument. Oh, but won't clothes become more expensive when you have like major companies like H&M selling shirts for $1 in America? Then they're not paying them anything. You know what I mean? Like, just imagine the sheer growing the cotton, processing the cotton, then taking that cotton and then bringing it to a factory where it's made into a shirt, then shipping that shirt, from Bangladesh or Guatemala or whatever to America for it to be sold for $1. they're not, you can afford to pay more for a shirt because they're actually, that's like slave labor. They're not really being paid anything at that point. Just to throw that into context, like the cheapness, and then you're not even going to wear it.
I mean, there's all sorts of things going on. But first of all, it's probably not going to be the price wouldn't even go up a great deal anyway. But secondly, the money from that, you may be saving the money on the high street, but actually, if you didn't have clothes coming in from the Far East that are being sold for $1, then it's going to allow there to be a bit more room for local traders to be able to do something with selling clothes, which is good for the local economy in America or in Britain or whatever. So there's all sorts of reasons why I don't really see any benefit, even on a cynical level, from having this kind of cheap labor. I mean, it's great when you pick up a bargain for £5 or whatever at a cheap store on a kind of superficial level, but at a national, international level, and in the big picture, it doesn't do anyone any favors really, except for the company is hoarding its money and then investing it offshore. So
right, or to buy soccer teams and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Your Russian oligarch types, but it's like we're all fooled by this thing of the kind of the weird thing of the micro and the macro. It's like, you were talking earlier about, I know you, I'm not saying you were buying into it particularly badly, but that thing of like, I feel sorry for Theresa May. It's like, no, fuck Theresa May. She's just a human being. Why are you worried about this? Of all the people to worry about in the world, why her? It's the same thing with clothing. Like we all, like, if we'd be like, you won't believe how much this pair of socks costs.
Yeah.
Well, it's made my day, it has. But, but we also know at the same time, at the back of our minds, and the more we can get that back of our mind to be working properly, we also know that these pair of socks that we're so gold encrusted socks or whatever it is, I don't know what I'm thinking about the low costier socks, but you know what I mean. But we also know that there's this huge, it's completely pointless that you've got that anyway, because you're about to go and spend £10 on wine or 15, £20 dinner or whatever it is anyway, and the socks is neither here nor there, and the price of all other goods is going through the roof and not keeping up with inflation. The whole economy's screwed. But you also know that there's this whole welter of pain that's being caused, but that has created your socks, so, or your new lovely baseball cap or whatever you've got.
Right.
So it's like we all need this kind of, like, psychologically, we need to feel that everything is normal and okay, and that we're getting a bit of a bargain, and that life's not too bad, and that maybe if we just made Theresa May a nice cup of tea, it'll all be okay. But actually, we know that's not right. We know that there are systematic things going on that are forces that are which are causing which basically means all this little day-to-day sort of wadamy calls and ujima flips are just kind of neither here nor there. It's just sort of what we do to get through the day,
No, absolutely.
But you know what I mean.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, completely. Again, I mean, it's not even just the clothing one is a really fantastic example. But again, I mean, you also talk about British military and covert operations in Nigeria to ensure that Shell can operate, and so you can get so-called cheap oil, for your car and whatnot.
As if we actually control the price of oil, like the price of petrol seems to be going through up all the time, and always has, and very commonly does. It's like we don't control the price of oil; OPEC does. And what happens on the international markets and international foreign policy determines what happens to oil. So that's just it's just sort of insane, really.
No, totally.
To think that we're benefiting from Shell.
Yeah, exactly. No. When you make, when Tim makes a point like, this is not in our national interest. There's no interest in this. There's an interest for the elite in the UK to carry out operations on behalf of Shell. it's in their interest for sure, but it's not in a national interest.
It's interesting that it's because it's such a sort of mosaic as well. I often forget what it's easy to sort of think that there's one thing going on, then you kind of forget that there's something else going on. But think about the Britain's involvement in the war in Yemen as well, for example. I wish I could find the exact words for this, but it was so bizarre. I've heard it a couple of times where Foreign Office officials basically say, we're involved in supporting actions on the ground in Yemen, but we're not in an alliance with Saudi Arabia. It's like, well, if you're basically setting the targets up for the Saudis to bomb the hell out of these, you are in an alliance with them. Of course you are. I think they didn't even use the word. I think they said working with. And then there was another guy who's I can't remember his exact title now, but he was another one of the Foreign Office people who said, we recognise that we're on the wrong side in this war, but we're still going to continue to sell weapons.
Oh, good. At least you're on the wrong side.
It's just in sort of this insane way of looking at the world, and I think that's what we're sort of trying to. I think that all comes out, I think, quite well. Also, I'm just looking at a couple of notes here. Training the Burmese army. I mean, it's like we've been told for a long time that that no outside forces affect Burma in the same way, a bit like North Korea being the hermit kingdom.
Right.
But actually, there is a bit of support here and there, and it comes from our countries. Like I think there's some timber companies as well that are involved in Burma as well, which is not exactly great. I think given it's one of the world's worst dictatorships. But yeah, British forces training the Burmese army as it commits genocide against the Rohingya people.
Oh, and have Aung San Suu Kyi basically open up Burma to a bunch of major mining corporations and timber entities and what. I mean, she's just a total Wall Street shill at this point. This is the great, long-suffering freedom fighter of Burma. I mean, and who just basically on record saying, I'm not really gonna. I don't believe there's a genocide against the Rohingya.
Mm-hmm.
This is the great woman we've propped up.
And then also, Britain's role in supporting the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, for example. Allied with NATO during the Kosovan War, Britain's involvement in Libya as well. These things, it's so easy to forget all these things, because of kind of like just poor historical memory. And Libya is like, everyone knows that we just smashed Libya to pieces, and then there are a huge migration crisis.
Yes,
and I know obviously some people do draw the link between this massive influx of people, millions and millions of people pouring across the borders into Europe, and a handful of them coming to Britain. But that shouldn't be a sort of an afterthought, or I wonder what caused this. It should be the very first thing. We caused it by smashing Libya to pieces in 2011, killing 30,000 people, incidentally, in the first year by our own estimates, probably an underestimate. And then we didn't bother keeping the figures after that. Now, what on earth do you expect is going to happen to that country? And that whole, quite why and how that NATO intervention led by France, with Britain and America as well, very heavily involved, quite how and why that happened is also something of a disaster and a disgrace. But what do you expect? People worry about immigration, people worry about Brexit, people worry about freedom of movement, and the fact that people can, just go from one country to another in Europe. Well, that wouldn't be so much of a problem if we hadn't just destroyed a perfectly viable state on the edge of Europe and created this mass migration. So,
well, Matt, I mean, it's the same thing here. The way the U.S. complains about, all those rapists coming from Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua. I mean, if we hadn't destroyed those countries and continued to destroy them, then they wouldn't be fleeing. I mean, in much the same way that we're We're trying to, destroy Venezuela. And they love to talk about all of the refugees fleeing into Colombia. Well, what happens when all those refugees start fleeing into America? Are we going to open them with open arms? Or are we going to turn our backs on them?
Yeah. Venezuela is a really interesting case. It looks to me like Maduro is, not a kind of great leader, but the price of oil has plummeted, so it's been hard to keep that economy going very well. And then as soon as there's this hint of well, there's more than a hint of something going wrong, but as soon as there's a weakness with the Venezuelan government, then of course that's when the calls for a coup come out. And but it seems to me that the British Labour Party have got the sort of right position on that, which is to say that some kind of negotiated settlement, which is being proposed by local countries in the area, rather than being imposed from on high by Britain and America, would be probably be the solution to that. But we'll see if that one spirals out of control. In the international field, it's already out of control in Venezuela itself. But it's definitely one to keep an eye on.
Oh, totally. Matt, I know I probably kept you for longer than we anticipated. I of course have there's more stuff I'd like to cover with you regarding this book and other stuff, and I'd love to to have you back on the show again sometime soon. It's been a while since we've had time to talk, and there's just so many other things I wanted to cover with you. Is there anything that you wanted to add to the discussion? Anything about the book in particular? I'll just throw in, because obviously a lot of my listeners are interested in the conspiracy culture and many of the critiques I've made. There is a great chapter about conspiracies and your experience at a recent David Icke, I don't even know what to call it, presentation. Anything you want to say on that?
I don't think there's a great deal I want to say on it, but I think the discussion speaks for itself. And we talked a long time about the nature of conspiracy theories, how you can pick those apart, and our own sort of experiences with that kind of way of thinking. And I just think that, you're probably right. That I think that a lot of your listeners, whether American or British or wherever, hopefully you'll enjoy a lot of the stuff about Britain. But even where you start to think, well, I know enough about Britain on this now. I think you'll also find that we are plugging into things like David Icke and Alex Jones and conspiracy culture and a range of subject areas that I think will be sort of talking points that are already in your lives, rather than things that are from outside and related to United Kingdom.
Absolutely. No, and again, I highly encourage people to go and get a copy of the book. Once again, the title of the book is Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy. It's by T.J. Coles and Matthew Alford. Matt, of course, was my guest. Matt, is there any are you on social media, anything like that, website you want to plug?
I don't really bother too much with websites and things like that. I do have a Facebook account, which is Facebook / The Writer with No Hands. That's / after Facebook, The Writer with No Hands. And people are very welcome to contact me on that, or just click like on it, and then you'll get sort of updates of things that are to do with media, propaganda, cinema, conspiracy, and British and American foreign policy in particular. Those kind of areas I think you'll find interesting.
Absolutely. And you're also on Twitter as well, right? It's the same Writer with No Hands?
I do use... I don't really use Twitter that much. It's best to contact me on Facebook, but I should use Twitter, but I'm a bit...
Well, we'll try and change that. But yeah, again, we'll link up to Matt's Facebook page. Matthew Alford, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much, Piers.
So, for example, in Nigeria, where Britain is involved basically with Nigeria largely to support Shell oil, and this is causing massive pollution. It's had fairly direct impacts on human rights abuses as well. In places like Sri Lanka, where we've supported the repressive government there against the Tamil, for example, which has led to war, arguably even genocide, and that's this is not to say that Britain has sole responsibility, but there's partial responsibility there, and it's often not known because it's kind of swept under the carpet by the British media.